Well, hello, church history friends. My name is Barb Walden, and it is a joy to welcome you to our first program in the 2022 Spring Lecture Series. Thank you all for joining us. I hope you are looking forward to exploring the art, story, and identity and community of Christ history as much as I am this spring. The Spring Lecture Series is not only a great way to learn church history, it's also an opportunity to help support church heritage. Donations received during the lecture series will go to developing new educational programs. It'll help fund young adults in the Alma Blair internship program and to continue our ongoing support for the maintenance and preservation of all Community of Christ historic sites. Peter will drop the online donation link and mailing address into the chat soon. Thank you all for your support, friends. It's also my pleasure to welcome Kristen McKay this evening. Kristen serves as the site director at the Joseph Smith Historic Site in Nauvoo, Illinois, a site that will be opening up later this spring. Kristen is here to tell us about some exciting opportunities at the historic sites.
Good evening, everyone. I'm very excited to be here with you all this evening. We have a significant need for volunteers and interns this summer at the Joseph Smith Historic Site in Nauvoo. And Barb will be putting up some information about how to spread the word about our significant need at the sites this summer. If you have children or grandchildren who you think might be good fit for internships at historic sites, we are certainly still accepting applications. They just need to go to the church website, seaofchrist.org, and scroll all the way down to careers and click on the professional career opportunities, and you'll see the availability we have there for Nauvoo interns. If you're interested in volunteering at sites yourselves, you can go to our website for the site, which is explorenauvoo.com, and click on Work With Us and find out more information about volunteering at the sites. We have a need for maintenance volunteers, interpretation volunteers, store volunteers, really anything. So if you are a willing volunteer yourself or have friends or family who you think might be a good fit, please send them our way. And thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Kristen. Now it is my absolute joy to introduce you to our guest speaker in tonight's program, an old friend, Eric Paul Rogers. Eric is a lifelong Brighamite raised in California, Wyoming, Montana, and Tennessee. And his interest in Mark Hill Forscutt grew out of his research into the Morrisite movement. Ron Romig and Barbara Bernauer were especially helpful in providing access to Forscutt materials that are at the Community of Christ Library and Archives in Independence. Eric now lives in Salt Lake City, where he conducts educational research for Latter-day Saint seminaries and institutes of religion. He has been a member of the John Whitmer Historical Association since 2000. And you can learn more about his professional and academic activities by going to his website, which is ericpaulrogers.com. So thank you, Eric, for joining us this evening to kick off the new lecture series. I'll turn things over to you as we are all very eager to hear more about the fascinating life of the musician, the missionary, and former Morrisite, Mark Hill Forscutt.
Thank you, Barb. I appreciate that very much. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I have some slides to share with our audience. As you know, the title for tonight's presentation is Mark Hill Forscutt, Mormon missionary, Morrisite apostle, and RLDS minister. And I've chosen those three titles because of Forscutt's involvement in each of those restoration movements. And in terms of chronology, his service as a Mormon missionary in England spanned the period of 1855 to 1860. His time as a Morrisite apostle from 1860 to 1862, and then as an RLDS minister from 1865 to 1903. So that period of time as an RLDS minister is significantly longer than the other two, but the other two might be more or less familiar to some in the audience. And so I might spend a little bit more time there than I do on the last period, but I hope to give attention to all of those. This image is a painting of the Godmanchester Mill in England. And it was in Godmanchester that Mark was born in June of 1834 to Amy Hill and Robert Forscutt. The Forscutts had 3 children. Mark was the eldest. The 2 younger brothers of Mark actually passed away in their childhood. By the time that Mark was 8, both of his brothers had died. In 1853, so when Mark was 19, he had an encounter with Mormon missionaries. The plan was with him, he and his buddies, to go have some fun with the Mormon missionaries. And well, fortunately or unfortunately, the result of having fun with the Mormon missionaries resulted in Mark's baptism. And when he was baptized, his father said to him this: "Take your things and get out of my house and never step foot in it again until you give up that religion." So his decision to join the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints resulted in ostracization from his family. Within 2 years of his baptism, however, he was called as a full-time missionary by Orson Pratt. And on the occasion of his calling as a full-time missionary, he writes in his journal, "I feel too weak to undertake such a task, but am clay in the hands of the potter, willing to work and give my might to aid in the work, or cast myself entirely into the work of the Lord and go forth and spread the gospel." And I love this quote from Mark because it so well expresses his service to the Lord, independent of which organization he was a part of. He gave his all to everything that he did. So I'll start with that first period, his service as a Mormon missionary. To give you a little bit of an idea about where he served, his initial service was in the areas of Shipton and Norwich. Cambridge, you'll see, is just here to the south of that area. Godmanchester is about 17 miles to the northwest of Cambridge. So his initial missionary labors were immediately in the area, well, close to the area where he was born. He also would later serve in Manchester and in Preston. When he served in Preston, he would actually served as the president of the Preston Conference. Later, he wrote for the Millennial Star. This is actually an image from 1858, which was during the period of time that he was writing for the Millennial Star, which was the official church organ in England at the time. Later, he was called as the president of the Wiltshire Conference in the South before returning to the North and to Liverpool. Mark was a fantastic record keeper and diarist. And he actually noted in his diary that he had traveled 10,832 miles, of which he walked, quote, 7,986 and a half miles. So you think about during those 5 years, how much ground he covered. It was very significant. Preaching, establishing branches, strengthening branches of the church throughout England. But as was the case for many Latter-day Saints in that time period, he desired to go to Zion. But before he left, he married Betsy, or Elizabeth Betsy Unsworth, on March 25th, 1860 in Bolton, England, just 2 days prior to departing from Liverpool for the West. The emigration to Utah took place, like I said, just 2 days later on March 27th. And Mark and Betsy were aboard the Underwriter, which was bound for New York. Elder James D. Ross presided over 594 Latter-day Saint passengers. And of those, 70 were from Switzerland, with the remainder being from Great Britain. I've included the ship manifest here. And down here at the bottom, you can barely make out Mark H. Forscutt, 26, Cooper by profession, and Elizabeth ditto Mark Forscutt, age 24, his wife. And so they left. There was the voyage was not without its challenges. There were 4 deaths and 4 weddings. One of those weddings was between Johann Lebrecht Baer, or John L. Baer, and Susanna Siedler, that was aboard the ship. Mark sang at that wedding. And I bring this up because John Baer plays a significant role later in Mark's life and in the reorganization. Not only in the reorganization, but also in the Morrisite movement. So I'll make note of that here and address that in a little bit more detail later. It was a 32-day passage, and the underwriter arrived in New York on May 1st, 1860. From there, the immigrants made their way to Florence, Nebraska, which was the departure point for wagon and handcart companies. This is an image of a drawing of Florence, Nebraska at that time. Now, one of the couples that they met at Florence before they started the overland route to Utah were the Holts. And I want to share with you a statement that Elizabeth made. She said, Mr. and Mrs. Holt, former Utah Mormons, told us their experiences in Salt Lake City and urged and begged us not to go further. Their appeals were useless. Our paths were marked to the end of our journey, and we followed them cheerfully. So there were some warning flags, some signals that they were receiving from some of the saints that had returned from Utah and were heading back to the east. This is a drawing of Mormon pioneers departing Florence for Utah. The Forscutts were part of the 9th Handcart Company, which was captained by Daniel Robison. There were 233 individuals in that handcart company, and they left the beginning of June of 1860. Within 3 months, just under 3 months, the company arrived in the Salt Lake City Valley, August 27th. This is a drawing from 1860, which, for those of you that are familiar with the Salt Lake Valley, is a view from the foothills to the north, looking south across the valley. You can see possibly in the drawing here, the Jordan River flowing from Utah Lake in Utah County to the north into the Great Salt Lake, and the carefully orchestrated street system in Salt Lake. Mark and Betsy received their temple endowments and were sealed in the endowment house. Of course, the Salt Lake Temple was not completed until the 1890s. And so sealings and endowments were performed in the endowment house, which was adjacent to the foundation of the Salt Lake Temple at the time. So they arrived the end of August. They're endowed and sealed by the middle of November of 1860. Mark was immediately appointed as a secretary to Brigham Young, who is the second from the left in this image. These are all young brothers. He was also ordained to the Quorum of 70s and called as the president of the 62nd Quorum of 70 by Joseph Young, who is Brigham Young's brother and the second from the right. So think about, they arrive in Utah in August. They receive their temple work in November. Mark is immediately given significant priesthood responsibilities. However, with those responsibilities and with his close association with Brigham Young, there was pressure to enter into polygamy. And Mark and Betsy were not going to have any part of that. And so there was a break with Brigham Young. So what do you do now that you're in Utah and you've separated yourself from the leader of the church? Well, there were others who claimed leadership of the church. One of those was Joseph Morris. And by June of 1861, Joseph Morris, who claimed to be the rightful leader of the church, received a revelation to ordain Mark to the office of apostle. So in a very short period of time, there's this transition from Brighamite Utah Mormonism to the Morrisite movement. Now, I know that the Morrisite movement may not be familiar to some of you, so I'm going to give you a bit of background. Joseph Morris believed that God had called him to be the spiritual leader of the church, for Brigham to be the temporal leader of the church. And he communicated this to Brigham in a series of letters. Most of those letters, or some of those letters, exist in the archives here in Salt Lake City. In the margins of some of those letters are words like nonsense or balderdash. I don't know if Brigham wrote those or if his scribes did or his secretaries did. Needless to say, those letters weren't well received, nor were they responded to. However, between 1857 and 1862, Morris received dozens and dozens and dozens of revelations, which would have looked much more like a prophet to somebody that was familiar with the early church than the church under Brigham Young. As I said, Brigham rejected those claims, and Morris felt persecuted in the various communities in which he lived in Utah County, in Provo, in Pleasant Grove. Local leaders from Forscutt's point of view, or from Morris's point of view, were persecuting him. His wife was encouraged to leave him. He was made fun of. He was largely rejected by the local communities in Utah. However, as he moved from community to community, he was fairly charismatic and was able to gather a number of Latter-day Saints who followed him. Let me give you an idea of what he saw as his prophetic calling. The image that you see here are scepters that were created for what was called a foreshadowing ceremony among the Morrisites. So Morris definitely saw himself as a king, as the Lord's chosen and anointed one. And on his scepter was written this: "To all nations and people of all languages that now dwell upon the earth, be it known unto you that I am sent by the great King of Kings and Lord of Lords to rule over all Adam's posterity. And being his representative, I hold in my hand this emblem of power, unto which all the nations and kingdoms of the earth must bow. For I am the legitimate ruler over all the earth, and my authority is sanctioned by the first God. Therefore, I hold in my hand an emblem of power to represent his scepter, which will shortly be given unto me. I am Joseph Morris, president of the Melchizedek priesthood." Morris foresaw the day when Jesus Christ would come to the town square in Salt Lake City, and in front of all of those that had made fun of him would hand him his scepter as leader of the kingdom of God on earth. Followers of Morris eventually gathered to South Weber, Utah, near the mouth of Weber Canyon, along the banks of the Weber River. If you're familiar with Utah geography, you'll see Salt Lake City here to the south, to the bottom of the image, and then South Weber here at the mouth of the canyon. Ogden is here just to the north. Layton is just here to the south. Morris's followers occupied a fort that had been abandoned. It was called Kington Fort. It was named after a former Latter-day Saint bishop in the area, but it was abandoned in 1858. If you remember what was going on at that time, President Buchanan, US President Buchanan, had sent the US Army to put down the Mormon rebellion in Utah. And as Johnston's army was coming west, Brigham Young instructed the Latter-day Saints to move out of the counties to the north and move into the south to avoid confrontation with Johnston's army. And so it had been abandoned, and when the saints returned, they didn't occupy that fort anymore. It was left open. In June of 1861, Morris received a revelation that was interpreted by those that were following him as an injunction against planting any crops because Jesus Christ was coming, that would happen, as a matter of fact, on New Year's Day, 1862. And so they don't plant crops. They have this foreshadowing ceremony. They're preparing for the imminent coming of Jesus. I mentioned that in June 1861, Morris calls Mark Forscutt to be one of his 12 apostles. These are the words of the revelation that Morris received regarding Mark. It said, "You shall ordain my servant, Mark Hill Forscutt, to the office of an apostle, and I will be with him, for his heart is upright before me. I have seen his affliction, and I have prepared him for a mighty work, and he shall see no more distress." I wish that were true. That's my parenthetical insertion there. "For I will abundantly supply him with that which is necessary for his support in every respect." So on June 27th, 1861, just after Mark was ordained as an apostle within the Church of the Firstborn of the Morrisite movement, Betsy gave birth to their first child there at the fort in South Weber, and they named her Amy Elizabeth. Morris received an additional revelation in which he gave Mark responsibilities for publishing all of his revelations. That revelation was received on August 23rd. I want to say a little bit more about the Morrisite community. There were numerous conflicts that arose between the Morrisites and their Brighamite neighbors. Let me just give you a quick example. The sheriff in the area was named Lot Smith. He may be familiar to some of you. And a number of people gave an account where Lot rode into the fort, and the homes that surrounded the periphery of the fort were open. Lot Smith rides his horse into one of those homes, takes the hat off one of the men, and when the man retrieves it, Lot Smith brings him up on charges of theft. So there was a lot of that kind of animosity between the local Brighamites and the Morrisites, and that animosity just continued to grow over time. The failure to plant crops and to prepare for the winter would result in significant suffering that fall and winter and spring. Because of the suffering that was going on, because of the predictions of Morris that didn't come true, there were 3 of his followers in particular who decided to get out. And so in the middle of the night, they took what they considered their own possessions, which were considered from Joseph Morris's point of view as common property, and left. And so in response to that, Morris had a posse to go out and to retrieve that common property and to retrieve those individuals. They brought them back and imprisoned them within the fort. This image is believed to be the building in which those prisoners were kept. This is my friend Ed Cooper, who since passed away, but who is a local South Weber resident. And he took me and showed me this property that's on private property and shared with me the local lore and tradition around the Morrisite tradition, including the role that this building supposedly played in what became known as the Morrisite War. So what was the Morrisite War? Because of the imprisonment of these 3 individuals, their family members and friends petitioned the judge in Salt Lake City for their release. Judge Kinney issued writs of habeas corpus, which demanded the release of those individuals. However, they had confidence that the Morrisites would not simply hand them over. And so the deputy territorial marshal, Robert T. Burton, who you see in this image at the bottom right, was given responsibility by Judge Kinney to go to South Weber and to enforce the writ of habeas corpus that he had given. So as the territorial militia, by the way, the territorial, the commander was out of the territory at the time. That's why Burton, as deputy territorial marshal, executed the orders. And so as his militia moved from Salt Lake to the north, remember all those communities along the way that were in the map that I showed you? They gathered strength as they got to the bluffs on the southern side of that valley where Kington Fort was located. That area right now is what many of you would recognize as Hill Air Force Base. On the north side of the valley, on the bluffs, individuals lined up in their wagons to watch this conflict play out between the territorial militia and the Morrisites. Now, Morris had converted the local bishop, the South Weber bishop, and 16 of his congregants. As a matter of fact, John Taylor and Wilford Woodruff, apostles in the Brighamite organization, went to South Weber and excommunicated them. So you have a congregation of Brighamites of about 150, some of whom have now joined the Morrisite organization, and about possibly as many as 500 Morrisites. So they did pose something of a military threat in the area. And so there was, shouldn't be surprising to us that there was an expectation for armed conflict. And I won't go into the details about that conflict. Needless to say, it resulted in tragedy and death. The story goes, there are various accounts, and those accounts don't always line up. But there's some unanimity around those on the south side of the valley under Burton's command, firing a cannonball over the fort as a warning shot. There were communications supposedly going on between Morris and Burton. However, that warning shot was to tell them that they were serious. When the militia fired a second warning shot, according to them, it fell short of the fort and bounded through an open air bowery that was just outside the fort, just to the west, where the Morrisites had gathered while Joseph Morris was in the fort waiting for a revelation as to what to do. When that cannonball went through that open air bowery, it blew the chin off of Mary Christopherson. This is an ancestor of mine who is in the upper right. And you can see that her chin has been significantly injured. This image is later in life. She would have been 14 at the time of the attack. Remember when I told you I would talk about John Bear? This is a later image of John Bear as later in his life when he was a minister in the Reorganization. However, that same cannonball that removed the chin of Mary Christopherson killed his wife, Susanna, and their infant daughter, or infant child. I don't know yet whether that was a son or a daughter, and I don't know the name. So there were a number that were injured or killed by that second warning shot. And once that second warning shot took place, the Morrisites retreated into the fort, and a 3-day battle ensued, in which Morris and 10 others ultimately, including militia members, were killed. And several were also injured as a result. Mark, Betsy, and Amy survived the conflict. As a result of that conflict, the militia ultimately took control of the fort, and the majority of Morrisites were brought up on charges. However, they were all acquitted, but as a result of the conflict, the Morrisites scattered. Most went to 3 communities: Soda Springs, Idaho, and that's where Mary Christopherson and John Bear went. And then more of my ancestors who were part of that movement went to Deer Lodge, Montana, and another group went to Carson City, Nevada. So three primary Morrisite communities after the Morrisite War, after that June of 1862. Soda Springs, Idaho, Deer Lodge, Montana, and Carson City, Nevada. The Forscutts, as I said, did not stay with the Morrisite movement. Mark did not fulfill the command to publish Joseph Morris's Revelations, though some 24 years later they were published by Morrisites in San Francisco by the name of Dove. And I have a copy of that original first edition, only edition, Revelations of Joseph Morris under the title, The Spirit Prevails. The Church of the Firstborn continued for a number of decades in various locations and under different leaders, with the final manifestation of the movement surviving into the 1950s at a place called Racetrack, about 8 miles south of Deer Lodge, Montana. This image is one that I took a number of years ago, in which you can see it was a little meeting house. It still exists today. Above that main entrance, you see the House of the Lord. This was where the Morrisites met for up until the 1950s. At that time, leaders of the church, the final leader of the church, George Johnson, passed away, and the building was within family hands privately, but they were told not to do anything with the property and let it go to dust. To this point, they've held to those instructions. I want to share with you just 3 other little artifacts that relate to the Morrisite movement. You can see in this image on the left that's a modern headstone that has, but it still carries the name Joseph Werner, but the title Morrisite. He died about 1870, so 8 years after the Morrisite War. And even with the renewal of that headstone, that title Morrisite has remained. A number of years ago, I went knocking on doors in South Weber to see if anybody had artifacts related to the Morrisite War, and found at the home of one of the Peak families, P-E-E-K, a cannonball that they've preserved, that they said that they found on the site, and I've included it there with an image of Mary Christopherson. In 2006, the Daughters of the Utah Pioneers and Sons of the Utah Pioneers erected a monument to the Morrisite War site, on the Morrisite War site. That is still there to this day, gratefully. Previous monuments were put in place, but they were destroyed or defaced. And so not until 2006 has there been a monument that was erected that has survived until the present. So what did Mark and Betsy and Amy do? Now their Morrisite fellow believers have scattered. Some stayed in South Weber, but very few. They're no longer associated with the Brighamites. As a matter of fact, they're seen as apostates and therefore enemies of their Brighamite neighbors. And so in October of 1862, just a few months after the Morrisite War, Mark joined the California Volunteers. This is a military unit that was established at a place called Fort Douglas. This image is of Fort Douglas. It sits on the bench above Salt Lake City, which was intentional for the US Army to have a position there that established US federal control over the valley. At least that's the impression they wanted to give. While with the unit at Fort Douglas, Mark became a secretary and editor to the newspaper that was the anti-Mormon newspaper of the day, because it was written and financed by the military unit at Fort Douglas, by the California Volunteers. So you see Mark using his writing and his editing skills that he had developed as a young man as a missionary in England that he had intended to help the Morrisite movement with, is now bringing those skills to bear on with his military service. Now, this is 1862, so there's a civil war going on in the States, and they had believed that they were going to be deployed into the Civil War, but instead of going east, they were assigned to Ruby Valley, Nevada, to oversee and protect the overland stage route to California. And while in Nevada, Betsy gave birth to their second child, Lulu Sarah, on March 14th, 1864. By the end of the year, they would move from Ruby Valley back to Salt Lake City. And not surprising, and I feel a great deal of sympathy for Betsy here. She tells Mark, if you have any more religion, keep it to yourself and never bring it to me. I've suffered and had all I ever want. And we have to say, we can't blame her. I can't blame her at all for that position. This is an image of Salt Lake City Main Street in 1865. And this is the temple lot, the temple, what we now call Temple Square, where you can see the foundation for the tabernacle and for the temple here, and the location of where the assembly hall would eventually be built. So in this interlude between Morrisitism and being Josephites, how did they get there? Well, how do you become a Josephite? Well, Mark was discharged from the army in 1865, but before he's discharged, he secretly meets with Josephite missionaries in December of 1864. And the religion that they had to offer was one that was very familiar to him from his missionary service in England. And so without telling Betsy, he joins the Reorganized Church on New Year's Day, 1865. Mark was baptized by J.M. Putney and confirmed by Elder Putney and Elder Outwood. Eventually, he has to come clean with Betsy, but within just a few months, so he's baptized in January. By April, he's clerk of the conference for the Utah district. He's secretary, general church recorder, book agent for the Utah district. And on the release of Elder David Putney, he becomes a member of the presidency of the Great Salt Lake City branch. So immediately he steps into leadership in the RLDS church in Salt Lake City. Well, it probably comes as no surprise to you that that's not, that is a dangerous position to be in. And this image is not Mark, this is Alexander Hale. And I love the way that Alexander describes Mark. And he says in his diary that Mark's was the third home that he entered upon his arrival in 1866 in Salt Lake City. And Alexander says, Brother Mark, so this isn't a letter written back to his brother Joseph III. And he writes, Brother Mark is a diamond of the first water, keen, shrewd, and intelligent, one of God's zealous and fearless servants, fearless, energetic, active, and capable. He works for the Lord. And I love that description that Alexander gives. So as I said, Mark is somewhat in danger as an apostate. And on August 31st of 1866, he gets a note that says, if you're not out of the territory by the end of the week, you will die the death of a miserable apostate dog. I love my Brighamite brothers and sisters, but I'm also ashamed of some of the things, many of the things that were done. There were numerous other threats to Mormons and apostates throughout the territory. And Mark leaves the territory immediately based on that threat, leaving Betsy and Amy and Lulu in Salt Lake City. And he writes to Joseph in Plano. He says, I'll be in Plano as soon as I can. Times are lively in Utah. Dr. Robinson was murdered 2 days after I left. General Connor. General Connor is the leader of the California Volunteers at Fort Douglas. He says General Connor and 8 others were under orders from the Danite fraternity to leave or to die. And so Mark leaves and ends up in Plano. And by 1867, Mark is appointed to labor under special direction of President Joseph Smith. He preaches, he baptizes, he regulates and organizes the branches. He serves as clerk of conferences. And in 1868, he's ordained a high priest and appointed to preside over the Southern States Mission. So within only a few years of joining the reorganization, Mark's extensive travel and preaching, his high-profile assignments, and his closeness to Joseph make him a well-known member among the Josephites. I'm going to back up just a little bit to 1866. At the April 1866 annual conference, a committee was appointed to prepare the inspired translation of the Bible for publication. And the work of copying and engrossing the manuscript was given to Marietta Walker and Mark Hill Forscutt, both accomplished penmen who worked faithfully and well. And this wasn't the only thing that Mark collaborated with Marietta on. He also worked with her on editing the Sunday school paper, the Zion's Hope, and the True Latter-day Saints Herald. I believe Joseph III was the official editor, but much of the editorial work was done by Marietta and by Mark. Now, what about Elizabeth back in Salt Lake City? Well, again, it shouldn't be any surprise that Betsy divorces Mark in Salt Lake City in 1867 while he's having a good old time in the Midwest, moving the work of the reorganization forward. She says in a letter to him that she never wants to live with him again. This letter that I've highlighted here is an actual letter. You can see Mark's signature, you get an idea of his writing, but this is actually a letter that Mark writes to a mutual friend and says, please convince Betsy to change her mind. Please convince Betsy to change her mind and to come to the East. So Betsy and the girls ultimately left Utah in December of 1868. So this is more than 2 years after Mark leaves Salt Lake City for the States. They meet Mark in St. Louis, where Mark and Betsy were remarried on Christmas Day of 1868. Then 2 days later, the Forscutts decide they're going to bless the 2 girls in the reorganization. And well, I'll just tell you what Mark did. During the blessing of Lulu, he changes her name to Ruby Celeste and says, Betsy was rather indignant till I told her I had no intention to change it till led by the Spirit. I'm not sure that how well that satisfied Betsy, but we get a new name. So Amy Elizabeth is the oldest. Now we have Ruby Celeste, who will marry Leland Fonts. So the name Fonts ought to sound familiar to many of you. And by 1870, their 3rd and final child is born, Mark Zenas, in Plano, Illinois, on February 9th, 1870. I want to share with you a number of other highlights of Mark's contributions to the organization. When Joseph III's wife, Emmeline Griswold, passes away in 1869, Joseph moves in with the Forscutts. They're that close. Also in 1869, Mark was appointed by Joseph III to compile a hymnal. He began with this prayer, Lord, give me ability to write, to preach, to compose music in which the saints will delight, and let thy wondrous love permeate my soul so that I'll be an influence always for good. The Saints Harp appeared in 1870. This is an image of that first edition. And 88 of the selections contain poetic verse from Forscutt. In 1871, he was appointed to compile a second hymnal called the Saints' Harmony. That wouldn't be published until 1889. He was appointed as church secretary in 1872 and also called to serve as a missionary in England. He takes Amy, but he doesn't take Betsy. He felt bad about it, and I'll leave it at that. Forscutt also delivered the funeral sermon at the funeral of Emma in 1879. Mark and Joseph III held claim to the Kirtland Temple, so they were involved in the temple suit that took place in 1879, where RLDS church member E.L. Kelly, an attorney, filed suit to try to clear title to the temple. He was involved in the doctrinal crisis in which Jason Briggs and Zenas Gurley had their fellowship withdrawn. In 1889, finally the Saints Harmony was published with this wonderful musical notation at the top and text at the bottom. And one commentator wrote that Uncle Mark, as the Saints delighted to call him, was certainly the most able and honored musicians of the church in his time. Another explained that he had a natural talent for expressing the ideals of the movement in verse. And in 1893, Mark was called as a missionary to Tahiti. He eventually went, and then due to illness returned, purchased a church ship, the Evangelia, and composed a hymn for the dedication. He offered a long prayer at the dedication of at the laying of the cornerstone of Grayson College's administrative building, Gunsully Hall, and he was also there when it was dedicated in 1897. Mark was a member of the Quorum of High Priests and Dean of Students and offered the dedicatory prayer. And on one of my trips, Alma and Kabler pointed out the Forscutt home there in Lamoni I took a picture of. He was known as a prolific and very skilled speaker. The last few years of his life were in Nebraska City, Nebraska. This is the gravestone there at Wyuka Cemetery. He noted that he preached and conducted services in 1899. He had 220 services, 107 sermons, 44 administrations, 6 marriages, 7 children blessed, 7 funerals, and he kept those kinds of records for each of his in each of his diaries. Betsy died of a sudden illness on October 5th. Mark continued with their preparations to move to California, but died just 13 days later. And Ruby made a notation that he and Joseph had decided that whoever died first would perform the funeral service, and that's what Joseph III did. He said, Brother Joseph, or Uncle Mark, as he was generally called, was one of the ablest and most polished of the churchmen of his day, well-educated, cultured, of a distinguished bearing and courtly manners, an interesting and able orator. To all this, he added marked musical ability. Thus, he served ably in the missionary field, in the musical work of the church, and in later years as Dean of Graceland College. So through his preaching, his writing, his editing, his musical abilities, his organizational support and leadership and personal relationship, Forscutt played a very significant role in shaping the unique identity, theology, culture, and organization of the reorganized church in the 19th century. If you have materials or sources or insights that would help me strengthen my research, please share them with me. Here's my email address and my website if you'd like to know more about some of the other research that I've done.
Wow, Eric, that was absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing the story of Mark Hills Forscutt. There was so much good information in there. I think you could have talked for another hour and you still would have had us hooked on every word. I should also mention to those in the audience, if you want to learn more about Mark Hills Forscutt, Eric Paul Rogers has written and published an award-winning article on Mark Hill Forscutt, and it appears in the John Whitmer Historical Association Journal. That 2001 journal includes his article. It's volume 21 of the John Whitmer Journal. You can find it online if it's not already on your bookshelf by going to the John Whitmer website, and that's jwha.info. So again, it was published in 2001 as volume 21, and the article is definitely worth a read. And thank you for helping us officially launch the spring lecture series.
You're welcome. Thank you so much. Is Barbara Bernauer on? Can I just say, Barbara, I love you and thank you for treating me so well. I know that the period that we've talked about tonight was one of significant contention between our churches, but I feel a part of you, and Barbara and Barb Walden and Locke Mackay and Mark Scherer and so many others of you, Ron Romig, I mentioned, have been part of me feeling just a part of your family. And my good friend Don Brown, who's been a friend of mine for many years, we don't even think of each other as cousins anymore, right? We're brothers and sisters. And I hope that being brothers and sisters in Christ, it is our primary identity. And I want to thank you all for making me feel that, helping me feel that. Thank you.
Thank you for those kind words. And those sentiments are certainly reciprocated. We so appreciate all that you do to preserve Latter-day Saint heritage and to continue to educate others on this incredible story. Thank you for the gift that you are. And thank you for presenting tonight. You have truly set the stage and set the bar pretty high for all of the historians that are going to follow you in this series.
Thanks, Barb.
Also, thank you to Peter for helping out behind the scenes. Thank you to Seth while we had him for helping out. And lastly, we want to share our thanks to you, our church history friends in the audience, for your love of a good story and for generously supporting the Community of Christ historic sites with your donations. Thank you so much for your support. Now, I encourage you to tune in next week as we hear from Andrew Bolton. Andrew's going to share the story of Charles Derry in a presentation called Charles Derry, First Reorganization Missionary in the British Isles. This is sure to be a good presentation, and I hope you're able to make it. Also note that Andrew will be presenting from Leicester, England next Thursday, and we want to accommodate Andrew's time zone, and we'll host the program at 1 p.m. Central Time next week. There are a few guest speakers presenting from Europe during the spring series, and the start times will vary throughout the series in order to accommodate the time zones of our international speakers. All of the start times are included on the Spring Lecture Series website. And Peter's going to drop the link to the Spring Lecture Series webpage in the chat box. Be sure to follow that link to register for next week's program and any other programs that interest you. So until next Thursday, take care, everyone. Keep reading your church history and have a blessed night.
Bye.